The day was meant to be perfect. The air carried the scent of fresh roses. The golden afternoon light painted the cathedral walls, and the pews were filled with family, friends, and those who had witnessed the love story of Daniel Mercer and Evelyn Carter unfold over the years. Daniel stood at the altar, his heart pounding, his palms slightly damp. It was nerves, yes, but also anticipation. In just minutes, the love of his life would walk down the aisle, and their future would begin. Then came the silence, a long, stretched silence, unnatural in its weight. The murmur of guests turning to one another in confusion, the groom standing alone, waiting. Evelyn never appeared at the grand doors, and then his mother's voice, cold and clipped, "Daniel, come outside." In the dimly lit corridor of the church, his family stood waiting, his mother, his father, and beside them, his brother, Lucas Mercer, the golden child, the prodigy, the shadow under which Daniel had lived his whole life. And in Lucas's arms, Evelyn. She did not look like a woman caught in a mistake. She did not look guilty, nor regretful. If anything, she looked relieved. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said, voice steady. "I love Lucas." The words hit Daniel, like a blade to the ribs. He looked at his parents, expecting outrage, disbelief, even sympathy. Instead, he saw something far worse. Approval. "This is for the best," his father murmured. His mother, ever pragmatic, nodded. "You'll understand one day." Understand? Understand what? How they had all conspired against him? How the woman he had loved had been slipping through his fingers while they all turned a blind eye, or worse, orchestrated it. He took a step back, then another. How long? His voice barely came out, but Evelyn heard. Lucas squeezed her waist. Over a year. A year. A whole year. While he had planned a future, Evelyn had been living a double life, and his parents had known. Why? He turned to his mother, needing, desperate for, some kind of answer that made sense. She hesitated, but then her lips curved slightly, as if in satisfaction. "Because, Daniel," she said, "Lucas is the better man," left that night. He walked away from them all, his heart shattered, his faith in family and love in ruins. But the story did not end there. Daniel was not a fool, and he did not believe in coincidences, a year-long affair, his parents' unwavering support, the timing, so perfect, so brutal, it reeked of planning, and Daniel, for the first time in his life, decided he would not be the fool they thought him to be. So he started digging. And what he found unraveled everything. His father's business, Mercer Enterprises, had been in dire straits for 2 years. Lucas, the favored son, had made risky investments that had nearly bankrupted them. But there was one thing that could save them, Evelyn's inheritance, a fortune so vast it could erase all debts. But there was a catch. Evelyn's father had made it clear Daniel would be the one to inherit alongside her. If she married him, they would control the estate, unless, of course, she married his brother. It had been a game of manipulation, a slow poisoning of trust. Whispered doubts in Evelyn's ear, subtle sabotage against Daniel, until she believed she had chosen Lucas herself. But she hadn't. They had chosen for her. And Daniel, he had been nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. 2 years later, Lucas and Evelyn were married. The Mercer family business had recovered, their debts cleared. And yet, unease clung to their household, because Daniel had vanished. No phone, calls, no social media, nothing. It was as if he had disappeared into the abyss, until, one night, Lucas received a single message, a simple text. "You should have made sure I stayed gone." That same night, Mercer Enterprises' stock plummeted, whispers of fraud, hidden scandals unearthed. An anonymous informant leaking documents that no one should have had access to, and then came the lawsuit. A devastating legal battle that stripped Lucas of everything. At the center of it all, a company, a rival empire, one that had suddenly emerged poised to take over the ruins of Mercer Enterprises. It bore a name that sent ice down Lucas's spine. DM Holdings. Daniel Mercer had returned. And this time he wasn't just taking revenge, he was taking everything. Lucas Mercer's hands trembled as he gripped the letter, the one delivered to his office just as he signed the final papers relinquishing his family's company. A simple, elegant envelope. No return address, just his name in crisp black ink. Inside, a note. Did you really think I would let you win? No signature. None was needed. Daniel was back, and he had planned everything. 2 years earlier. The night he walked away from his own wedding, from his own family, Daniel had nothing but the suit on his back and the unbearable weight of betrayal pressing against his ribs. But heartbreak, he learned, was a temporary thing. Betrayal, however, that was something he could build upon. In a quiet bar, miles away from the city he once called home, he nursed a whiskey and replayed the events in his head. The lies, the manipulation, the way they had stripped him of everything, all while smiling in his face. He wasn't stupid. He had always known he was the lesser Mercer in his parents' eyes. The spare. The afterthought. Lucas was the golden boy, the heir, the one who could do no wrong, until he did, until he nearly destroyed everything. And then Daniel had served his purpose, as a pawn, a disposable piece in their desperate attempt to salvage their empire. Evelyn had never been a choice. She had been a transaction. Daniel swirled his glass, ice clinking softly. If they had been willing to use him, they had made one fatal miscalculation. He would use them right back. The rise of Daniel Mercer for 2 years. Daniel disappeared from their world. But he did not disappear from the game. First, he studied, ruthlessly, financial markets, corporate law, business warfare. He devoured everything. Then, he traveled, built alliances, shook hands with men who had once been his father's enemies, learned from those who had once been his brother's rivals, and slowly, methodically, he built something of his own. DM Holdings. It started as a whisper in the financial world, an enigmatic investor making quiet but calculated moves. Then, a force. Acquiring companies his father had deemed worthless, restructuring failing businesses with surgical precision, and then the masterpiece, the takedown of Mercer Enterprises. One by one, the secrets unraveled. The shady investments, the mismanaged funds. Documents appeared in the hands of regulators, anonymous leaks that exposed every rotten deal Lucas had ever made. The board lost faith. The stocks plummeted, until Mercer Enterprises was nothing but a hollowed-out shell, and just as Lucas thought he could salvage something, DM Holdings appeared with a buyout offer, the ultimate humiliation. The fall of Lucas. Mercer Lucas stared at his reflection in the glass windows of his now empty office. This was supposed to be his kingdom, his legacy. Instead, he had been outplayed. And the worst part? He knew Daniel was not done because Daniel did not just want their company. He wanted everything. And Lucas had a sinking feeling he knew what was next. Evelyn. A knock at the door. Evelyn Mercer had been restless all evening. The house was quieter than usual. Lucas locked away in his study, no doubt raging over his failure. She sighed, pouring herself a glass of wine. She had thought she had won, thought she had made the better choice. Lucas had promised her a life of power, wealth, a future that Daniel could never provide. And yet here they were, a ruined name, A failed business. A sinking ship. A knock at the door startled her. She frowned. It was late. Cautiously, she opened it, only to feel the air leave her lungs. Daniel stood before her. Not the Daniel she had left at the altar. Not the man she had once known. This man was different, sharper, colder. His dark suit tailored to perfection, his eyes unreadable. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, finally, Daniel's lips curved into the smallest, most knowing smirk. "Miss me?" Evelyn's grip on the doorframe tightened. For a moment, she considered slamming the door in Daniel's face, pretending she hadn't seen him, pretending the ghosts of the past hadn't returned to collect their debts. But she knew better. Daniel. Mercer had not come here for pleasantries, so she swallowed, steeled herself, and met his gaze. "What do you want, Daniel?" Daniel's smirk didn't waver. If anything, it deepened. "Now, Evelyn," he said smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "That's a dangerous question to ask a man you betrayed." She let him in because she had no choice. The price of betrayal Lucas, locked in his study, had no idea Daniel was in his house. He had no idea that while he was drowning in his failures, the man who had orchestrated them all was standing in his living room, speaking in a voice as calm as a knife sliding into flesh. "I have everything now," Daniel said, swirling a glass of whiskey that she hadn't seen him pour. He looked around the room, the lavish decor, the chandelier above them. Everything Lucas thought he was entitled to. And yet, he turned his sharp gaze back to her. "There's still one thing left." Evelyn's throat went dry. She knew. She knew before he even said it. "You." Her pulse hammered against her ribs. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned in, voice low. "I want you to leave him." Evelyn let out a short, bitter laugh. "You think I'd run back to you after everything?" Daniel chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in it. Evelyn, I don't want you back." He took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down. "I just want to watch him lose you too." Lucas's last stand-it didn't take long for Lucas to realize something was wrong. When he stepped into the living room and saw his brother sitting comfortably drinking his whiskey, something inside him snapped. "You," Lucas growled, fists clenching. "Get the hell out of my house." Daniel barely glanced at him. "Your house?" He gestured around. "It won't be for much longer. I just bought it." The color drained from Lucas's face. "No, it couldn't be." "You're lying," he hissed. Daniel reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and placed it neatly on the table. Lucas snatched it up, eyes scanning the document. "Finalized property acquisition, DM Holdings." Lucas felt his breath hitch. "You?" "Yes," Daniel said simply. "Your debt's finally caught up with you, brother. The banks don't trust you anymore. The assets had to be liquidated." He took another slow sip of his drink. "I bought them all." Evelyn took a sharp breath beside him. "All?" Daniel turned his head toward her and smiled. "Every last one." Lucas staggered back, his mind reeling. His business, his money, his home, everything was gone. And Daniel had made sure of it. But the final blow was yet to come. Daniel stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "I'll leave you two to pack. Your things. The new owners take possession in 48 hours. He walked to the door, pausing only briefly to look over his shoulder at Evelyn. "You should come find me when you realize what a mistake you made." And then he was gone. The final move Lucas Mercer had always been the golden child, the heir, the one destined to win. And yet, as he stood in the wreckage of what had once been his kingdom, he understood something for the first time in his life. Daniel had never been the weaker Mercer. He had only been the patient one. And now, he had won. The game was over. Or was it? because as Daniel stepped into the waiting car, a shadowy figure in the back seat handed him a folder. He opened it, read the contents, and smiled. The game wasn't quite over yet. There was still one last secret left to be revealed. Daniel Mercer ran his fingers along the edge of the folder, feeling the weight of the secrets within. The car's interior was dim, the city lights flashing through the tinted windows as he stared at the document in his lap. A single name was stamped at the top: Evelyn Carter Mercer. And below it, something that made Daniel's smirk fade into a cold, calculating stare. The secret no one saw coming. The folder contained financial records, medical documents, private messages, all gathered by the private investigator Daniel had hired months ago. He had expected to find traces of infidelity, perhaps proof that Evelyn had been playing both brothers for even longer than she admitted. What he found was far worse. Evelyn never loved Lucas either. The affair had been real, yes, but not for the reasons anyone thought. Evelyn had been given little choice. Daniel's parents had orchestrated more than just his downfall. They had coerced Evelyn into leaving him, using leverage only a desperate woman would understand. Buried deep in the documents was a single medical report: Evelyn's mother, terminal illness. The Mercers had promised to pay for every treatment, every experimental therapy, but only if she left Daniel and married Lucas. And Evelyn? She had agreed. Not because she loved Lucas, not because she wanted Daniel to suffer, but because her mother would have died without their money. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the pages. This changed everything. Evelyn wasn't just a betrayer. She was a prisoner. And Lucas had known. The rage that simmered beneath Daniel's skin had been a quiet, patient thing before. Now, it threatened to consume him entirely. Lucas hadn't just taken Evelyn, he had stolen her freedom, and that was something Daniel would not allow to stand. Lucas's last mistake. Lucas Mercer sat in the wreckage of his former life, drowning in whiskey and self-pity. His company was gone, his wealth erased, his home taken. And Evelyn, she had barely spoken to him since Daniel's visit. She wasn't crying, wasn't raging, she was just distant, and that terrified him more than anything. Say something, he muttered from across the room, watching her sit by the window. Her arms wrapped around herself, she didn't turn to face him. What do you want me to say? She asked softly. Lucas clenched his jaw. That you still choose me. At that, Evelyn finally turned, and her eyes were colder than he'd ever seen them. I never chose you, Lucas, she whispered. His stomach twisted. Don't say that. Evelyn's expression didn't waver. I didn't love Daniel the way I should have, she admitted, her voice distant, as if speaking to herself. But at least with him, I was free. Lucas stood abruptly, rage bubbling under his skin. You think Daniel is going to save you now? You think he's some kind of hero? He scoffed. He's worse than me, Evelyn. At least I never pretended to be something I wasn't. Evelyn's gaze didn't falter. No, Lucas, you're worse. The silence stretched. Then her phone buzzed, a single message. She read it and, without another word, she rose from her chair, grabbed her coat, and walked toward the door. Lucas surged forward, grabbing her wrist. Where are you going? She looked down at his grip, then up at him, to the only person who ever really gave me a choice. And with that, she was gone. The final confrontation. Daniel was waiting. She found him in a private suite overlooking the city. His city now. He stood by the window, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of bourbon. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another. Then finally, Evelyn spoke. You knew, didn't you? Her voice was barely above a whisper. About my mother, about everything. Daniel took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down. I didn't, he admitted. Not until today. Evelyn's breath caught. Then why did I destroy Lucas anyway? He let out a soft, humorless laugh. Because he deserved it. Because he took everything from me. A beat of silence. And what about me? She asked. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her. What about you, Evelyn? She swallowed hard. Do I deserve it too? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward her, closing the distance between them until they were mere inches apart. You tell me, he murmured. Did you ever love me? Her breath hitched. The hesitation was answer enough. Daniel gave a slow nod. Then no, Evelyn. You don't deserve revenge. He turned away, walking back to the window. You deserve something much worse. Evelyn clenched her fists. And what's that? Daniel's voice was quiet when he answered. Freedom. Evelyn blinked. What? Daniel turned back to face her. And for the first time that night, there was no malice in his expression. No anger, just something she couldn't quite name. I'm letting you go. Evelyn's heart pounded. You can stay with Lucas if that's what you want, Daniel continued. Or you can leave. Start over. Do whatever the hell you want. He exhaled, shaking his head. 1 year later. The world had moved on. The Mercer name, once a beacon of power and prestige, had crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. Mercer Enterprises no longer existed. It had been absorbed, broken apart, and rebranded under DM Holdings. Lucas Mercer had vanished from the public eye. His last known whereabouts placed him somewhere in Europe, drowning in failed investments and forgotten debts. And Evelyn Carter Mercer had disappeared too. At least, that's what everyone believed. A chance encounter. Paris. A small cafe on the Rue Saint-Honoré. Daniel Mercer sat at an outdoor table sipping an espresso, the crisp morning air carrying the scent of fresh croissants and expensive perfume. He was dressed simply. No suit, no armor of wealth or power, just a man enjoying the quiet of his own victory. A soft click of heels on cobblestone. He didn't have to look up. He knew. She slid into the seat across from him without a word. For a long moment, they simply watched each other. Evelyn had changed. The sharp, calculating gleam in her eyes had softened. No longer a woman weighed down by the expectations of others, but one who had finally learned to breathe. Daniel smirked. Didn't think I'd ever see you again. Evelyn tilted her head, studying him. Neither did I. A pause. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she set something on the table between them. A playing card, the King of Hearts. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What's this? Evelyn leaned forward, her voice just above a whisper. A new game. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. And here I thought you were done with games. Her smile widened. Not all of them. Another pause. Then, finally, Daniel picked up the card, and for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the past, only the possibilities ahead. 1 year later, Monte Carlo. The casino glittered under the golden chandeliers, the murmur of high-stakes conversations mixing with the gentle clink of champagne glasses. The elite of the world gathered here, not just to gamble, but to conduct business, the kind of business that never made it into the news. At a private table in the VIP lounge, Daniel Mercer sat across from a man whose reputation preceded him, Victor Langley, billionaire investor, ruthless kingmaker, a man who had single-handedly toppled governments with a well-placed deal. Victor smirked, setting down his cards. It's not every day I see a Mercer sitting at my table. Daniel, relaxed as ever, sipped his drink. It's not every day someone like you makes a mistake. Victor's eyes narrowed, intrigued. And what mistake would that be? Daniel glanced down at his cards. The king of hearts still in his hand. He turned it slowly between his fingers before setting it on the table. The one sitting across from you. Victor chuckled. Bold. Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You're going to lose tonight, Langley. He tapped the cards in Victor's hand. And not just this game. Victor's amusement flickered. Are you threatening me, Mercer? No. Daniel smiled, slow and deliberate. I'm telling you how the night is going to end. And just as Victor was about to respond, a voice interrupted them. Smooth, confident, familiar. I hope I'm not too late to join. Both men turned. Evelyn stood there, dressed in a midnight black gown, a delicate diamond bracelet resting against her wrist. The dealer pulled out another chair, and she slid into it effortlessly, placing a single card onto the felt table. The Queen of Spades. Victor's gaze flickered between them. Realization dawning. You two, he muttered, exhaling. This was a setup. Daniel chuckled. Oh, Victor. He leaned back, utterly at ease. You should know by now. He tapped the King of Hearts once more. The best way to win the game is to control all the players. Evelyn smirked, lifting her glass. In a silent toast, Victor Langley had no idea what was coming. But one thing was certain. The game was only just beginning. Victor Langley had built an empire on reading people, predicting their next move before they even made it. But as he sat across from Daniel and Evelyn, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. He leaned back in his chair, swirling, the amber liquid in his glass. So tell me, Mercer, what exactly is your endgame? Daniel smirked, casually adjusting his cufflinks. Endgame? Now, Victor, that would imply I'm playing by your rules. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. You always did underestimate people like us. Victor's smirk faltered just slightly. That wasn't something Evelyn Carter Mercer should have known. Daniel caught the hesitation in his expression and chuckled. Ah, I see. You thought Evelyn was just another pretty piece on someone else's board. Lucas's pawn. My mistake. His smirk deepened. You never realized she was a queen in her own right. Evelyn reached into her clutch, pulling out a small silver flash drive and setting it on the table between them. Victor's fingers twitched. He didn't need to see the contents to know it was bad. Very bad. Evelyn smiled sweetly. I believe. You recognize this? Victor exhaled slowly. I suppose it would be pointless to ask how you got it. Daniel leaned in, voice low and amused. Very. The collapse of a King Victor Langley had spent decades buying politicians, laundering money, and burying scandals that could topple entire economies. His greatest strength wasn't his wealth. It was the illusion of control. But tonight, he had lost that illusion. Evelyn slid the flash drive closer. This contains everything, Victor. Shell corporations, backdoor deals, bribed officials. It's all there. Daniel tapped the edge of the drive. And let's not forget those, rather, interesting offshore accounts linked to certain high-profile donations. Victor's jaw tightened. He forced himself to maintain his composure. You're bluffing, Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Would you like to bet on that? The dealer turned his gaze to Victor expectantly. The table had fallen silent, the weight of the moment suffocating. Victor had two options, fight or fold. He could call their bluff and risk losing everything, or he could surrender. For the first time in his life, Victor Langley made the only move left. He reached into his jacket, retrieved a pen, and signed the document Daniel placed before him, the contract that handed over controlling shares of Langley International Holdings. When he finished, Evelyn took the pen, inspecting the signature with satisfaction. Daniel leaned back, his smirk triumphant. "Pleasure doing business with you, Victor." Victor stood, his face unreadable. "You two will regret this." Evelyn tilted her head. "No, Victor. We planned this." Victor narrowed his eyes, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked away, his empire slipping through his fingers with every step. The aftermath as the last glass of champagne was poured, Daniel and Evelyn sat alone at the table, their victory cemented. Daniel toyed with the King of Hearts, flipping it between his fingers. "You think he'll try to take it back?" Evelyn smirked, sipping her drink. "He might." Daniel chuckled. "Let him try." She turned to him, eyes gleaming. "So what now?" Daniel met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Now, we build something bigger." She raised her glass. "To the next game?" Daniel tapped his glass against hers, his smile knowing. "To the next game." And just like that, the two most dangerous players in the world disappeared into the Monte Carlo night, leaving behind nothing but the ruins of a fallen king. The end, for now. A sea of opulence stretched out beneath the Burj Al Arab's private penthouse, where only the most powerful and ruthless gathered. Daniel Mercer sat in a room filled with billionaires, politicians, and exiled royals. The air was thick with the scent of Cuban cigars and expensive whiskey, the low hum of conversation mixing with the distant call to prayer from the city below. Evelyn stood beside him, dressed in an emerald green gown that shimmered under the chandelier lights. She wasn't just part of the scenery, she was the centerpiece. Every man in the room watched her, but only Daniel held her attention. Their empire had grown. Langley International was now a footnote in history, absorbed into Mercer Global Holdings, a shadowy conglomerate that moved trillions without ever being seen. Banks, tech firms, luxury hotels, and underground markets. It was all theirs. But tonight wasn't about wealth. Tonight was about war. Enter the new player. The doors opened and the room fell silent. A man entered, flanked by two silent bodyguards. He moved with the slow confidence of someone who never had to rush, because the world waited for him. Gabriel Laurent, French, billionaire, arms dealer, shadow broker. He wasn't just rich. He was dangerous. Daniel had spent the last 6 months dismantling his operations piece by piece, driving up the cost of his weapons, freezing his accounts in Switzerland, and ensuring that his shipments never made it to their destinations. Laurent had come to Dubai for one reason, to end the war before Daniel finished it for him. Laurent took a seat across from them, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Mr. Mercer, I must say, you've been quite the problem for me." Daniel smirked, setting his whiskey down. "I do have that effect." Laurent's gaze flickered to Evelyn. "And you? I hear you were once an obedient little trophy wife." Evelyn's smile didn't waver. She leaned forward, her voice a whisper of silk and steel. "And now? I'm the one signing your execution order." A flicker of irritation crossed Laurent's face. But he hid it well. Daniel chuckled, sitting back. "Let's be honest, Laurent. You didn't come here to talk." Laurent's smirk returned. "No, I came here to offer you one last chance." He gestured to a briefcase beside him. One of his men placed it on the table, opening it with a quiet click. Inside, stacks of crisp euros and a single black ledger. 200 million euros, Laurent said smoothly. "And a list of names. People I can make disappear for you." He met Daniel's gaze. "In exchange, you stop interfering in my business." Evelyn reached forward, taking the ledger. She flipped through it, her expression unreadable. Daniel didn't even look at the money. Instead, he smiled. "That's a generous offer, Laurent." He folded his hands. "But there's a small problem." Laurent raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Daniel took a slow sip of his whiskey before answering. "You think you still have a choice?" Laurent frowned. Excuse me? Evelyn set the ledger down, her eyes gleaming. We don't negotiate with dead men. Laurent's expression barely had time to shift before the doors swung open again. A dozen armed men walked in. Not Mercer's men, not Laurent's. Interpol. The room exploded into chaos as officers stormed the penthouse, weapons drawn. Laurent shot to his feet, his hand darting to his gun, but Daniel simply raised his glass in a silent toast as the officers surrounded him. Laurent turned to his guards, his voice a furious snarl. Do something! Too late. His bodyguards were already lowering their weapons. One of them leaned in, whispering something in Laurent's ear. Laurent's face went white. Daniel's smirk deepened. Ah, he murmured. I see you've realized it. Laurent's breath was ragged now, his hands clenching into fists. You... Daniel nodded. Yes, I own them too. The lead Interpol agent turned to Daniel. Mr. Mercer, as agreed. He handed Daniel a small envelope. Laurent's eyes darted between them, horror dawning. You made a deal? Daniel tilted his head. Oh, Gabriel, you don't climb to the top by breaking the law. He gestured lazily around the room. You climb to the top by writing it. The agents hauled Laurent to his feet, slapping cuffs onto his wrists. His face twisted with fury as he thrashed against them. This isn't over, he roared. Daniel stood, adjusting his cufflinks. Oh, it is, he said. You just haven't accepted it yet. As Laurent was dragged from the room, Evelyn leaned in close to Daniel. You enjoyed that? She murmured. Daniel smirked. A little. The chaos faded as the last of the agents left. The other guests, billionaires, politicians, and criminals, were frozen, watching Daniel and Evelyn in stunned silence. No one spoke, because everyone had just witnessed something unprecedented. Daniel Mercer had just destroyed one of the most powerful men in the underworld, without firing a single shot, the Bay. Rome belonged to him now. Dubai belonged to him now, and soon the world would too. 3 years later, New York City power, true power, not the fleeting kind held by billionaires or politicians, not the illusion of control that men like Gabriel Laurent once believed they had. No, Daniel Mercer and Evelyn Carter Mercer now wielded something far greater. They had built an empire in the shadows. From Dubai to Hong Kong, London to Moscow, nothing moved in the world of finance, crime, or politics without their influence touching it. Presidents consulted them. Fortune. 500 companies relied on them. Entire governments collapsed on their word. Mercer Global Holdings was now a sovereign entity, unbound by the rules of nations, operating through a web of proxies, offshore accounts, and untouchable shell corporations. And yet, at the height of their reign, a storm was coming, one final move in a game even they hadn't foreseen. The warning Daniel stood in the penthouse of their private Manhattan skyscraper, staring down at the city that now danced on his strings. The lights of Wall Street flickered below, oblivious to the silent war unfolding in the shadows. Evelyn entered, dressed in sleek black, her eyes sharp. He's making a move, she said. Daniel didn't need to ask who. Alexander St. James. Name that had been whispered in classified intelligence briefings and secret boardrooms for decades. A ghost. A myth. Until now. St. James had no corporation, no official wealth, no face in the public eye, and yet he controlled a network more powerful than any nation's intelligence agency. He had spent years watching them, studying them, waiting, and now he was coming for them. Daniel turned to Evelyn. Do we know what he wants? Evelyn handed him a file. More than we ever expected. Daniel opened it and froze. Inside were pictures of them. Not business deals, not offshore accounts, but moments no one else should have been able to see. A dinner in Paris, a private yacht in Greece, a whispered conversation in a Hong Kong hotel. St. James had been watching them for years. Daniel exhaled slowly, closing the file. He's not after our business. Evelyn nodded. No, this is personal. A rare flicker of something crossed. Daniel's face. Uncertainty. For the first time in years, he wasn't holding all the cards. Evelyn leaned in. So what's our move? Daniel's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. We remind him that the house always wins. The meeting, the Mercer name was whispered in fear and respect across the globe. But Alexander St. James, he was feared by those who feared them. And yet, 3 nights later, he walked alone into their world. A private club in New York. No security. No entourage. Just a man in a tailored suit, his presence effortlessly commanding. Daniel and Evelyn were waiting in a dimly lit VIP lounge, glasses of aged whiskey untouched on the table. St. James slid into the seat across from them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he smiled. You've done well. His voice was smooth, almost amused. Better than I expected. Daniel tilted his head. And yet, you still came. St. James leaned forward. Because it's time. Evelyn's eyes darkened. For what? St. James's smile didn't waver. For you to decide. A pause. Then he placed a small black envelope on the table between them. Daniel didn't move. What's this? A choice. Evelyn's fingers brushed the envelope but didn't pick it up. St. James continued, voice soft but sharp. You've built something extraordinary. But power, real power, requires sacrifice. He gestured around them. Are you ready to pay the price? Daniel's expression didn't change, but Evelyn saw the subtle shift in his eyes. He understood. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were being tested. And what lay ahead? It wasn't just a game, it was war. The black envelope sat on the table like a loaded gun. Daniel didn't move, neither did Evelyn. Across from them, Alexander St. James watched with the patience of a man who had already planned every possible outcome. Finally, Evelyn picked up the envelope. It was smooth, heavy, made of paper that wasn't just expensive but custom-made. No markings, no insignias, just a quiet promise that whatever was inside would change everything. She opened it. Inside was a single playing card. The Ace of Spades. Daniel exhaled slowly. He knew exactly what it meant. The Ace of Spades wasn't just a symbol. In their world, it was a declaration. A war was coming, and St. James had just invited them to play. The invitation, Evelyn set the card down between them. Cute. Her voice was cool, but there was an edge beneath it. But we don't accept invitations. We give them. St. James chuckled. And yet, here we are. Daniel leaned back. You went through a lot of trouble to get our attention. I wanted you to understand something. St. James steepled his fingers. You think you're at the top, that you own the game. He gestured at the Ace of Spades. But you've only been playing on one board. Daniel's expression didn't waver. But Evelyn caught the flicker in his eyes. St. James wasn't just threatening them. He was educating them. He continued, voice calm. You built an empire in finance, politics, and crime. Impressive. But true power? He smiled. It doesn't exist in ledgers or offshore accounts. It exists where no one thinks to look. Daniel narrowed his eyes. And where is that? St. James reached into his jacket, pulling out a small gold coin. He placed it on the table next to the Ace of Spades. The coin was old, ancient, a Roman denarius, nearly 2,000 years old, inscribed with the image of a faceless emperor. Evelyn stared at it, her instincts buzzing. What is this? St. James smiled. A key. Daniel finally picked up the coin, rolling it between his fingers. It was worn, but the weight of it felt real, important. St. James leaned in. There is a society older than any government, older than any name you've ever encountered. It does not trade in money. It trades in control. Evelyn's grip on. Her glass tightened. And you're saying we've been working for them all along? St. James shook his head. No, you've been allowed to exist because of them. Silence. Daniel turned the coin over once more before setting it down. And you? His voice was dangerously soft. Are you one of them? St. James's smile never faltered. I am their messenger. A pause. Then he gestured at the ace. Of spades! This is your only chance. Step onto the real board. He tapped the gold coin. Or be removed from it. Daniel and Evelyn exchanged a glance. For years, they had thought they were the architects of the world, that they had built something no one could touch. But now, they had a choice. Enter a world they never even knew existed, or fight an enemy, older than history itself. The final question, Daniel's fingers hovered over the gold coin. Evelyn's gaze remained locked on St. James. This was it. The moment everything changed. Would they accept the invitation, or burn the board down? You decide. How the empire rises or falls. For a long moment, the room was silent, heavy with tension, the weight of their decision pressing down on them like a storm about to break. Daniel looked at the coin again, his fingers brushing against its surface, feeling the centuries of history. Etched into it, a key. It was more than a coin. It was a door. And the world behind that door was something neither he nor Evelyn could comprehend. Evelyn's gaze remained unwavering, her expression unreadable, yet the storm in her eyes told a different story. She had made her choice. Finally, Daniel spoke. His voice low but steady. Do you think we are afraid? St. James smiled again, that eerie, knowing smile. No, you've never been afraid. That's why you're still here. Daniel stood, turning away from the table, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the New York skyline. The city below hummed with life, unaware of the battle being waged above it. Then why offer us this, St. James? Daniel's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. Why now? St. James's eyes glinted. Because your empire is small, a shadow of what it could be, and you're too smart to let that happen. You know that the game you're playing now is the only one that matters. Evelyn leaned forward, her tone deadly calm. You think we don't already control everything? That we've built this empire out of nothing? I don't think you know half of it, St. James replied, his voice smooth and almost pitying. I think you've been dancing on the edges, Daniel. Evelyn, this... He gestured around them. This is nothing. Evelyn stood slowly, the grace with which she moved a stark contrast to the fire in her eyes. She looked at Daniel. So, we join you. It wasn't a question. No, Daniel replied, his voice firm. We don't join him. St. James's smile faltered just for a second. We take it all, Daniel said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. Every last piece. Evelyn's eyes gleamed. We burn it down. The finality of the words hit the air, with a thunderous crack. The Empire strikes back. By dawn, Daniel and Evelyn were already making preparations. The rules had changed. They no longer played in the shadows, no longer content to simply be players on the board. It was time to own the game. The first order of business was dismantling everything St. James had built, every contact, every ally, every whisper he had, planted into governments and corporations. Daniel was methodical, each move calculated, each piece falling into place. He had already begun turning his empire into something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined, a counterstrike. Evelyn was equally ruthless, orchestrating silent wars behind the scenes, cutting off resources, shutting down their rivals, before they even knew what was happening. Her networks were vast, and with every move, she tightened the noose around their enemies. It wasn't just power they sought anymore, it was control. The kind of control that would make even the shadows bow to them. They moved swiftly, the world around them unaware of the storm they were about to unleash. St. James's counter-move days passed, and the world remained in its normal, frantic pace. But behind the scenes, Daniel and Evelyn's war had already begun. However, just when they thought they had the upper hand, St. James revealed his first strike. Daniel received a message, a single line of text. "You can burn down this empire, but it's already ours." It was from an anonymous source, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. St. James had anticipated every move. The unseen forces that night, Daniel and Evelyn sat in their penthouse, the city's glow casting long shadows. They were not alone. A man sat across from them, his face hidden in the dark corners of the room. "You don't know who I am," the man said, his voice cold. "But I know who you are. I've been watching you for years." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The man leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "My name is Victor Orloff. I represent the Silent Circle, the very people who created the world you've been playing in." Daniel's fingers drummed against the armrest. "And why are you here?" Orlov's lips curled into a smile. "Because you're not the only ones who've been playing the game. St. James is part of us, but so are you." Daniel and Evelyn exchanged a glance. This was no ordinary player, Orlov continued. "What you don't realize is that St. James isn't just trying to destroy you, he's testing you, and you're failing," Evelyn scoffed. "We don't fail," Orlov's smile faded. "You're too reckless, too fast. You're playing the wrong game, and it's already too late for you to win it." Daniel stood up slowly, his eyes boring into Orlov's. "If you're here to tell us we can't win, then leave." Orlov chuckled darkly. "No, I'm here to offer you an opportunity. To join us, to become part of the Silent Circle. There's still time, but you have to accept who controls the real game." Daniel's voice was a whisper, but the room seemed to still. The decision loomed before Daniel and Evelyn. The weight of the world rested in their hands, but this was no longer about power or wealth. It was about the truth, a truth that had been buried beneath layers of manipulation and lies for centuries. Victor, Orlov's words had rattled them to the core. The Silent Circle, a group so powerful, so hidden, that even the most dangerous men in the world didn't know they existed, and they controlled everything. For a brief moment, Daniel considered the offer, to join them, to align with a force that could make them unstoppable. No more threats, no more enemies, an unchallenged rule over the world. But then the thought flickered out. He was no one's pawn. Evelyn met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw the same defiance. They were not meant to bow to anyone, not St. James, not Orloff, not anyone. They were the masters of their fate. "We burn it down, Victor." Evelyn's voice was as cold as steel. "We tear down the circle, and every illusion of control with it." Orlov's eyes darkened. "You don't understand what you're saying." Daniel's laugh was low and full of contempt. "You're right. We don't understand. But we're going to make sure we do." Orlov's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't a game you can win by brute force." "And yet, we've been playing by our own rules," Daniel replied, the arrogance in his voice matched only by the confidence in his eyes. "If you think you're the only ones who can shape the world, think again." For the first time, Orlov's composed exterior cracked. The Silent Circle had spent centuries working in the shadows, pulling the strings, orchestrating the rise and fall of empires. And now they were about to face the most dangerous opponents they had ever encountered, Daniel and Evelyn Mercer. The war begins. Within hours, Daniel and Evelyn launched their plan. It was swift, calculated, ruthless. First, they crippled Orlov's networks, pulling the strings they had carefully woven over decades. They targeted his connections in finance, hacking into systems no one else could breach. Billions of dollars vanished in an instant, wiping out key players in the Circle's operations. Then they went after his alliances, the politicians, the CEOs, the global influencers who had been feeding from the Silent Circle's power for years. Blackmail, extortion, threats, all their darkest secrets exposed to the light. It was a war fought in silence, in the shadows of the digital world. But the world began to feel its tremors. The Silent Circle, once an unseen force, was now on the defensive. They had underestimated the Mercers, but what they didn't know was that Daniel and Evelyn weren't just playing the game. They were redefining it. They were pulling the strings now. They were the ones who controlled the world, not the other way around. And the real game was about to begin. St. James's true intentions. As the dust settled, the Mercers found themselves facing a new problem: St. James. It turned out his role in the game was far more intricate than they had ever imagined. He wasn't just an agent of the Silent Circle, he was a savior of sorts. Or rather, he had played a long game, one where he didn't just want control, but he sought to reshape the world completely. The war he had waged against them wasn't just personal, it was philosophical. He believed that power should not lie in the hands of a few elites, but in the people, in the masses. He had orchestrated the chaos to break the systems down, to make way for something new, something radical. He had gambled everything, knowing that the Mercers, driven by their ambition, their need to destroy the Circle, would eventually be the ones to tear down the old order. St. James hadn't come to destroy them. He had come to guide them. Daniel and Evelyn learned all this in an encrypted message from a contact inside St. James's inner circle. The message contained one simple line: "You'll need me if you want to survive what's coming." The final confrontation. The night was thick with tension. Daniel and Evelyn had prepared. The last piece of the puzzle was in place. They stood in a hidden underground facility beneath New York. The entire operation had been set up in secret. No one could trace them. Not St. James, not Orloff, not even the remnants of the Silent Circle. Then, the doors to the facility opened. St. James stepped inside. There was no need for introductions. They knew each other too well. "What do you want?" Evelyn asked, her voice steely and composed. St. James smiled, that enigmatic, dangerous smile. "What I've always wanted. The world reborn." Daniel crossed his arms. "By destroying everything?" "Yes," St. James said, his voice unwavering. "Everything. You fought hard to reshape the game. But the truth is, you can't. Win the game without changing the rules." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You're no different than the Circle." The room crackled with an electric tension, every word that passed between Daniel, Evelyn, and St. James charged with the gravity of their decision. The weight of empires, of futures, hung in the balance. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about control, creation, and the very nature of the world itself. Evelyn stood firm, her back straight, eyes locked on St. James, as if she could burn him alive with her gaze. "You think you can tear down everything we've worked for? That you can simply reshape the world with a flick of your wrist? You're as arrogant as the Silent Circle." St. James's smile remained unchanged. "You misunderstand me. I'm not here to destroy what you've built. Well, not entirely. I'm here to give you the real power." "And what would that be?" Daniel asked, his voice dark and filled with skepticism. "Freedom," St. James said, almost with reverence. "True freedom. A world without rulers, without the corrupt systems that have existed for millennia, where everyone has the same chance to control their own fate, where the game isn't rigged from the start." Evelyn scoffed. "It sounds like a utopia, one that only exists in your head. St. James leaned forward, his expression turning serious, almost intense. Do you really believe that? Do you honestly think the world is better off with the elite holding all the strings? The people you've been exploiting, manipulating, pulling down to build your empire? It's a system that's never worked, no matter how many times you play the game. Daniel clenched his jaw, every instinct telling him to reject St. James's words, to burn everything down and start over. The memories of betrayal, of manipulation, of the silent circle pulling the strings on every deal, on every life, were fresh. The anger in him burned hot. But then, there was that whisper of truth, something that St. James had said that stuck in his mind. True freedom. For the first time, Daniel questioned whether his empire, this ironclad world he and Evelyn had built, was really the world he wanted to rule. Or was it simply another layer of chains? The choice: tear down or rebuild. The silence stretched long as Evelyn and Daniel exchanged a look, a wordless conversation that seemed to stretch across time and space. Their ambition, their hunger for power had always been what drove them, but now there was a different vision before them. Evelyn spoke first, her voice soft but full of fire. We've been living in a world of smoke and mirrors, Daniel. We've built it on the back of others, pretending we were gods. But look around us. What have we really created? More chaos, more control, more lies? Her words pierced through the fortress of his mind. For the first time, Daniel felt the weight of the world settle on his shoulders. They had spent their lives bending it to their will. But at what cost? St. James's voice cut through the air again, calm, almost hypnotic. The world is ready for change, ready for someone who isn't afraid to tear down the walls. Are you going to be the ones to make that happen? Or will you keep playing the same game? Evelyn turned to Daniel. His decision was the one that would define everything. But maybe it wasn't just about tearing it all down anymore. The convergence Daniel's gaze softened just for a moment. He had built his empire with fire and blood, but what if there was another way? What if, for once, he could make the world something different? A place where freedom wasn't just a dream, but a reality? St. James. Daniel's voice was low, almost a whisper. What exactly do you want from us? I want you to help me tear down the system. But more importantly, I want you to help build something new. Something that isn't based on the same old game. Something the world has never seen before. Evelyn's eyes met Daniel's. Are we really willing to sacrifice everything for this dream? Daniel nodded, his gaze steely. We've sacrificed everything already, Evelyn. For power, for control. What's left for us if we don't try to create something that matters? St. James took a step closer, as if the decision had already been made. This is a war that can't be won with force. It's a war of ideas. And you two? You're not just players anymore. You're the architects. The words hung in the air like a promise. They were going to reshape the world. The rebirth of the empire, the decision was made. Daniel and Evelyn joined St. James's vision, not as pawns, but as the ones who would remake the game. Together they would build a world free from the chains of the old powers, the silent circle, the corrupt elites, the puppet masters who had controlled the fate of millions from the shadows. But their plan wasn't one of destruction. It wasn't a simple rebellion against the old order. What they envisioned was a reconstruction, a new system, one based on transparency, on equality, on real power for the people, not the few. The room crackled with an electric tension, every word that passed between Daniel, Evelyn, and St. James charged with the gravity of their decision. The weight of empires, of futures, hung in the balance. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about control, creation, and the very nature of the world itself. Evelyn stood firm, her back straight, eyes locked on St. James, as if she could burn him alive with her gaze. You think you can tear down everything we've worked for? That you can simply reshape the world with a flick of your wrist? You're as arrogant as the silent circle. St. James's smile remained unchanged. You misunderstand me? I'm not here to destroy what you've built. Well, not entirely. I'm here to give you the real power. And what would that be? Daniel asked, his voice dark and filled with skepticism. Freedom, St. James said, almost with reverence. True freedom. A world without rulers, without the corrupt systems that have existed for millennia, where everyone has the same chance to control their own fate, where the game isn't rigged from the start. Evelyn scoffed. It sounds like a utopia, one that only exists in your head. St. James leaned forward, his expression turning serious, almost intense. Do you really believe that? Do you honestly think the world is better off with the elite holding all the strings? The people you've been exploiting, manipulating, pulling down to build your empire? It's a system that's never worked, no matter how many times you play the game. Daniel clenched his jaw, every instinct telling him to reject St. James's words, to burn everything down and start over. The memories of betrayal, of manipulation, of the silent circle pulling the strings on every deal, on every life, were fresh. The anger in him burned hot. But then there was that whisper of truth, something that St. James had said that stuck in his mind. True freedom. For the first time, Daniel questioned whether his empire, this ironclad world he and Evelyn had built, was really the world he wanted to rule. Or was it simply another layer of chains? The choice: tear down or rebuild. The silence stretched long as Evelyn and Daniel exchanged a look, a wordless conversation that seemed to stretch across time and space. Their ambition, their hunger for power had always been what drove them. But now there was a different vision before them. Evelyn spoke first, her voice soft but full of fire. We've been living in a world of smoke and mirrors, Daniel. We've built it on the back of others, pretending we were gods. But look around us. What have we really created? More chaos, more control, more lies? Her words pierced through the fortress of his mind. For the first time, Daniel felt the weight of the world settle on his shoulders. They had spent their lives bending it to their will. But at what cost? St. James's voice cut through the air again, calm, almost hypnotic. The world is ready for change, ready for someone who isn't afraid to tear down the walls. Are you going to be the ones to make that happen, or will you keep playing the same game? Evelyn turned to Daniel. His decision was the one that would define everything. But maybe it wasn't just about tearing it all down anymore. The convergence, Daniel's gaze, softened just for a moment. He had built his empire with fire and blood. But what if there was another way? What if for once he could make the world something different? A place where freedom wasn't just a dream, but a reality. St. James. Daniel's voice was low, almost a whisper. What exactly do you want from us? I want you to help me tear down the system, but more importantly, I want you to help build something new. Something that isn't based on the same old game. Something the world has never seen before. Evelyn's eyes met Daniel's. Are we really willing to sacrifice everything for this dream? Daniel nodded, his gaze steely. We've sacrificed everything already, Evelyn. For power, for control. What's left for us if we don't try to create something that matters? St. James took a step closer, as if the decision had already been made. This is a war that can't be won with force. It's a war of ideas. And you two? You're not just players anymore. You're the architects. The words hung in the air like a promise. They were going to reshape the world. The rebirth of the empire. The decision was made. Daniel and Evelyn joined St. James's vision, not as pawns, but as the ones who would remake the game. Together, they would build a world free from the chains of the old powers, the silent circle, the corrupt elites, the puppet masters who had controlled the fate of millions from the shadows. But their plan wasn't one of destruction. It wasn't a simple rebellion against the old order. What they envisioned was a reconstruction, a new system, one based on transparency, on equality, on real power for the people, not the few. The world would change, but the price would be steep. Months had passed since Daniel and Evelyn made their fateful decision, aligning themselves with St. James and his vision for a new world order. The dust had settled, and on the surface everything seemed calm, almost too calm. The new power, structures were in place, and the people had begun to feel the first stirrings of hope. Change was in the air, but beneath that air, something darker was stirring. Daniel and Evelyn stood together, overlooking the skyline of New York, the city. They had once ruled in shadows, now the shining symbol of their new world. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden glow over the buildings, but the light was dimming as night approached. "This feels almost too quiet, don't you think?" Evelyn asked, her eyes scanning the horizon. The wind ruffled her hair, but her expression remained serious, unyielding. Daniel's gaze remained focused on the city. "It's always the calm before the storm," he murmured. "And when that storm comes, we need to be ready." Evelyn turned to face him, her eyes intense. "You're worried. I can see it. What aren't you telling me?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "There's a shift happening. I can feel it. People are waiting for something, either for us to prove we're different or for us to fail." Evelyn smirked, her usual confidence radiating. "Let them wait. They'll see that we can do more than the silent circle ever could. We're building something new, Daniel." But Daniel wasn't so sure. He could see the cracks forming. Beneath the surface, factions were already emerging. Groups of people who had once been part of the old regime, the elites they had toppled, were starting to organize in secret. Whispers of rebellion were spreading. They had made enemies, enemies who wouldn't go down without a fight. "We may have reshaped the world," Daniel said, his voice filled with resolve, "but we haven't rid it of ambition. The underground far. Beneath the streets of New York, in forgotten tunnels and abandoned buildings, a quiet rebellion was brewing. It wasn't led by any singular person, but by a collective of the disillusioned, the forgotten, the betrayed. They were the remnants of the old power structure, people who had lost everything in the wake of Daniel and Evelyn's revolution. They were the ones who believed that power should belong to the few who truly deserved it. And now, they were planning to take it all back. At the heart of this underground movement was a woman named Lydia Graves, a former ally of St. James who had been betrayed by the very people she had once trusted. She had once helped orchestrate the downfall of the silent circle, but she had always had her own agenda, a vision that had nothing to do with the ideals Daniel and Evelyn were building. She believed in strength above all, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to restore the old order. Lydia sat in a dimly lit room with several others, their faces grim and determined. Maps of the city were spread out on the table, marked with red X's and circles. "We strike at dawn," Lydia said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "We go after their weaknesses, everything they've worked for. We'll turn the people against them. We'll make them realize that they're just like the others. And we'll take back control, starting with their empire." Her words echoed in the cold room, stirring the others into action. Lydia was ready. The world they had built was fragile, and she intended to shatter it. The repercussions of power. As Lydia and her followers moved in the shadows, Daniel and Evelyn began to notice subtle signs of unrest. At first it was small, protests in the streets, whispers of dissent among the people they had freed. But soon it grew into something more dangerous. They were no longer seen as saviors, but as the new oppressors, the new elite, just another set of rulers who took control of a broken world. One evening, while attending a meeting with key members of their newly established government, a piece of news reached Daniel's ears. A bomb had gone off in one of their newly rebuilt districts. A targeted attack. The symbol of the rebellion was clear, a broken coin, the same one Daniel had used in the early days of his power struggle, the same one that had once sealed his bond with St. James. Evelyn's eyes darkened when she heard the news. "They're coming for us. The rebels. They're real." "We knew this day would come," Daniel replied, his voice strained. "But I never expected it to happen this quickly." "We've given them power, Daniel. The people feel it. They can smell the scent of control. It's the only thing that matters." Evelyn was right. The ideals they had promised to uphold, freedom, transparency, equality, had begun to feel empty. The people they had hoped to elevate were now beginning to question their methods. Were Daniel and Evelyn any better than the men and women they had overthrown? The lines had blurred. The enemy within. The air was thick with uncertainty. Despite their best efforts, the rebellion was no longer a quiet whisper in the shadows. It had grown into an undeniable roar, shaking the very foundation of the new world Daniel and Evelyn had worked so tirelessly to create. Their empire, once impervious and brimming with promise, was now on the brink of collapse. Every day brought fresh signs of unrest, targeted assassinations, bombings, strategic leaks of classified information, and whispers of corruption, spreading through their ranks. It had been 2 days since the bombing, and the situation had only grown more dire. Daniel sat in the conference room, staring at the map of the city spread out before him. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. For the first time since he and Evelyn had started this journey, he felt the crushing weight of their impermanence. Evelyn, her expression hard and focused, was seated across from him, scanning over the reports that had come in. Her eyes met his, darkened by the weight of the decision that loomed before them. "St. James has gone underground," Evelyn said, breaking the silence. "We can't find him. It's like he disappeared into thin air." Daniel's hand clenched into a fist. He knew this was coming. He always knew. He was never on our side, not truly. We were just useful to him. Pieces on his board. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes burning with a cold fury. "And Orlov's shadow looms over everything. We can feel it. The circle has been rebuilding, slowly infiltrating everything we've worked for. They're patient. They've been playing the long game. And now, they're in a perfect position to strike." Daniel's jaw tightened. "The rebellion and Orlov. It's a perfect storm. We can't fight both. If we go after Orlov, we risk losing control of the people. If we try to crush the rebellion, we risk letting the circle slip through our fingers." Evelyn's lips curled into a small, bitter smile. "There's only one way to face a storm like this. Head on." The rebels' movement. Meanwhile, the rebellion was growing stronger. Lydia Graves, the leader of the insurgents, had proven herself a master strategist, using the power vacuum created by the Mercers to rally an army of disenfranchised citizens, former elites, and power brokers. They were not simply disgruntled citizens. They were a calculated force, one born of vengeance and a desire to return the world to its former, more predictable state. Lydia had her eyes set on one thing: retribution. For her, this was never about rebuilding the world. It was about reclaiming control. The ideals Daniel and Evelyn had promised, freedom, equality, transparency, had only been a tool to gain power. In Lydia's eyes, they had used those ideals as a mask to justify their own grab for dominance. And now, the people were starting to see through that mask. Her forces had infiltrated the heart of the city's power structure. They had planted spies in key positions, turning the very systems Daniel and Evelyn had set up against them. The public's trust was slipping away. Lydia's words echoed like a mantra in the minds of the masses. They are no different from the Circle, another set of elites pretending to care about you. But they are just another chain, and we will break those chains. Lydia stood in front of a group of her lieutenants in a dark underground room. The walls were covered in blueprints and maps, the same cityscape Daniel and Evelyn had studied so many times. But now, it was a map of destruction, the target zones where the rebellion would strike next. "We move at dawn," Lydia said, her voice ice cold. "We have the upper hand now. We've got the city's infrastructure under our thumb, and the people are ready to rise. They just need a little push. We hit them hard and we force them to choose, fight us or fall in line. This is the moment we take the city back." Orlov's masterstroke, but as Daniel and Evelyn were facing off with the growing rebellion, the real game was still being played from the shadows. Victor Orlov, the man they had once seen as an adversary, was no longer just a threat. He was a master of manipulation, weaving his influence through every crack in their world. Orlov had waited long enough. He had watched as the Mercers grew overconfident, thinking they could remake the world on their own terms. But now, as their empire crumbled, from both internal and external forces, Orlov was making his move. He had quietly begun to leverage his influence within the fractured remnants of the Silent Circle, gathering what was left of the elite and preparing them for his return to power. But his influence wasn't just confined to the old guard. No, Orlov had a deeper hand in the rebellion. Lydia Graves, the woman leading the insurgents, had no idea that Orlov was playing her like a pawn. He had infiltrated her inner circle. The air was heavy with the scent of gunpowder, and the flashing lights from the conflict outside flickered across the cold, sterile walls of the underground facility. The final showdown between Daniel, Evelyn, and Victor Orlov had begun. The battle was fierce. Orlov's loyalists, hidden in the shadows like ghosts, had anticipated Daniel and Evelyn's move. But the Mercers were prepared. The city had erupted into chaos above them, with both the rebellion and the remnants of the Silent Circle clashing in a deadly dance. Yet, this was no longer about a revolution. This was about power, and, at this moment, only one faction would emerge victorious. Daniel and Evelyn had fought their way through the labyrinthine halls of the facility, their hearts pounding with urgency. Every step was calculated, every move designed to get them closer to Orlov. But he wasn't easy to catch. Orlov had always been a step ahead, always the puppeteer in the shadows, and now he had lured them into the very trap they had tried to avoid. "We're close," Daniel said, his voice tight. They rounded another corner, their guns raised, eyes scanning the darkness. The facility's dim, flickering lights created a sense of dread, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant sounds of clashes above. Evelyn glanced at him, her expression unyielding. "We have to end this, Daniel, now." They reached the central chamber. It was massive, a cathedral of glass and steel, with an overwhelming sense of control hanging in the air. The walls were lined with screens showing live feeds of the chaos outside, both the rebellion and the Circle's forces clashing in a brutal standoff. Orlov stood at the center, surrounded by his most trusted followers. His face, as always, was calm, almost smug. "You're too late." Orlov's voice echoed through the chamber, his gaze locked onto Daniel and Evelyn. "The world you've worked so hard to create. It's already slipping through your fingers." Daniel's heart raced, but his voice remained steady. "This is the end, Orlov. You lose today." Orlov smiled thinly. "Do I?" "The people have already made their choice. You didn't just give them freedom, Daniel. You gave them chaos. And I will give them order." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her grip on her weapon tightening. "Order?" You mean control, tyranny. Orlov chuckled, the sound dark and cold. Call it what you will. Power is a tool, and I will wield it. The betrayal, within. The room went silent, save for the hum of the machines and the distant sounds of battle. Then, as if to underscore Orlov's words, the doors to the chamber slammed shut with a thunderous noise, locking Daniel, Evelyn, and their enemies inside. Daniel's eyes scanned the room quickly, realizing the trap was set. Orlov wasn't just going to fight them. He had planned for this moment, for their arrival. The facility had been rigged to explode if triggered. He had tied their fates together with a single, deadly move. Did you really think you could come down here, Daniel? Did you really believe you were safe? Orlov taunted, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Before Daniel could respond, there was a sharp sound, a metallic click. A hidden hatch opened from the floor. Lydia Graves emerged from the shadows, her once strong rebellion now fully under Orlov's control. She was not an enemy anymore. She had become part of the force that had played them both. You... Daniel began, his voice incredulous. But Lydia's expression was cold, unrecognizable. I told you I would take back control, she said simply, her tone devoid of remorse. The people need a true leader, Daniel, not one born of idealism and weakness. Orlov will restore order. He will give them strength. You gave them nothing but false hope. Evelyn, her face contorted with anger and betrayal, turned toward Lydia. You've made a deal with the devil, Lydia, don't you see? He'll use you just like he used us all. Lydia's lips curled into a bitter smile. You didn't understand it, Evelyn. I always knew this would end in blood. I wasn't naive enough to think we could build something permanent. It was never about that. It was always about power. The ultimate betrayal, Daniel and Evelyn were caught in a nightmare they hadn't anticipated. Orlov, Lydia, and their loyalists had sealed them in the chamber with no escape. The countdown on the monitors above them ticked down relentlessly. 5 minutes remaining. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, the subtle clink of chains, the march of soldiers. Orlov had prepared for every eventuality. He had calculated their every move and set a trap they couldn't escape. You think you're in control? Orlov said, stepping closer to Daniel, his voice quiet, mocking. I've been in control of this city long before you ever thought to change it. You were a threat to my vision, but now you're just another obstacle to be swept away.